Good morning. I invite you to come on in and be taking a seat and we'll get started. Jared is away visiting family this morning and he asked me if I would fill in for him, and so I'm of course honored to have that opportunity. And he mentioned to me that when he returns he intends to begin a study of the last week of Jesus' life. And so I thought I would try to do something that would supplement what he's doing without hopefully stealing any of his thunder. And I thought that this morning might be an ideal time for us to discuss a man who plays a very important role in that last week of Jesus' life, but has some background that goes much farther back than that. And that's the man named Herod Antipas. And so I thought it would be helpful to us perhaps to lay some background there, and so when Jared gets to the part where Jesus is tried before Herod Antipas, you'd have a little bit of a context to put that into. So let's talk for just a moment about, could you go to the next slide for me? There it goes, okay. Let's talk a little bit about the background of Herod Antipas. Now, let's orient ourselves for a moment in terms of time and place. When we leave the Old Testament at the close of the book of Malachi, the Persians are the world power that are in charge, and they are ruling over the Jews. They're ruling over Palestine. Within about 70 years of the close of the Old Testament, give or take, Alexander the Great, a Greek, comes onto the scene, and he begins to systematically defeat the Persians in a campaign that starts in his homeland around Macedonia, comes across Asia Minor, which we know today as Turkey, and then he comes down into Palestine, where he encounters the Jews in Jerusalem. From there, he goes on down into Egypt, and then from Egypt, he travels farther east, even as far as India, before his soldiers say, "We've had enough, we want to go home," and they end the campaign for him. En route back to Greece, Alexander dies in his early 30s, and that causes the land that he has conquered for the Greek Empire to be divided up, eventually into essentially 4 pieces. 2 of those pieces really don't concern our story, but 2 of them do. One piece is the piece that is primarily made up of Egypt, that was ruled by one of Alexander's generals whose name was Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And the Ptolemies initially took control not only of Egypt, but also of Palestine. Now, those of you who have been in my classes from time to time have probably heard me say this more than once, so feel free to let your mind wander for a moment. But Palestine is strategically a very important piece of land to the ancient Middle East. The trade routes that ran from the east around Mesopotamia and India and everything basically to the east of the Arabian desert did not come directly to the west to get to the Mediterranean Sea. And the reason they didn't come to the west is because you have the Arabian desert in the way. And it was extremely difficult to travel across the desert, especially with any kind of a caravan bearing goods and things of that nature. So rather than traveling due west, they would travel north along the river Euphrates and then come west in fertile ground and then come back down south through Palestine. And the trade route would carry them down through Palestine and then across the Sinai Peninsula and into Egypt, but all along the way they could branch off and go to these port cities that were located all along the coast of Palestine on the Mediterranean Sea. And in those port cities you had a people known as the Phoenicians, who were the ancient maritime traders of the ancient world, and they would take your goods and all of the things that you had brought from the east, and they'd put them on their ships, and they would sail them and sell them all over the Mediterranean. And so controlling Palestine in terms of commerce was a very strategic thing for any ruler to do, because you had access to a major portion of that trade route over land, and you had access to a number of important port cities. And so the Egyptians initially controlled this, the Egyptian Greeks, the Ptolemies initially controlled this, and then the Seleucids, who controlled the land to the north and east of Palestine, Syria, and a whole lot of the land farther east that had been a part of the ancient Persian Empire, they took control. And while the Jews, as a general rule, had a fairly peaceful relationship with the Ptolemies, that began to unravel fairly quickly after the Seleucids took control. And there was one Seleucid king in particular who was a major problem for the Jews, and his name was Antiochus IV. And he wanted to be known as Epiphanes. Epiphanes in Greek literally means appearance, but the significance of it was that he wanted people to know that he was God in the flesh. That was the interpretation of it. And so he thought obviously very highly of himself. And he was also a man known to be given to fits of spiteful rage. I don't know any other way to put it than that. And he became quite spiteful toward the Jews, and he began to enact some horrible atrocities on the Jews, forbidding them to observe the law of Moses, forbidding them to have copies of the law of Moses, forbidding them to circumcise their children, to observe the feasts and the Sabbath days and things of that nature. He killed a great many Jews, very, very bloody king, and in fact went so far as to profane the temple by setting up a statue to Zeus and sacrificing a pig on the altar of God in Jerusalem. And so you can imagine that the Jews hated being under Seleucid rule, and that was essentially the spark that gave rise to a revolt led by a man named Judas, whose nickname was Maccabeus. Maccabeus means the hammer. And there's all kinds of discussion in the scholars as to why he came to be known as Judas the Hammer. Some say that he wielded a hammer as a weapon in battle. Others say that he was the figurative hammer of God against the Seleucids. And we really don't know an answer to that. But at any rate, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers lead a revolt that ultimately overthrows the Seleucids and frees the Jews from their rule. Growing out of that revolt, there arises a Jewish dynasty of kings that rule for a period of give or take about 100 years. And that dynasty is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Very quickly, I won't get into all the details because there's a whole lot of intrigue and infighting and all of that sort of thing. It's a soap opera unto itself to read Hasmonean history. But they become very corrupt very quickly. And they begin, by and large, to side with a group of people who come to be known as the Sadducees. The Sadducees, that of course we read about in the New Testament, are, among other things, very open-minded to the Greek way of thinking about things, and very embarrassed, you might say, of the Jewish way of thinking about things. And they began to bring in Greek cultural innovations into Jerusalem and Judea and that area, and a great many of the Jews who had grown up under the law of Moses were scandalized by some of the things that they did. And so there arose a competing sect that we know in the New Testament as the Pharisees, who started out with the idea of being very closely true to the law of Moses. Now, by the time of Jesus, the Pharisees had sort of degenerated into a hypocritical, self-righteous political movement, but you have this rivalry between Pharisee and Sadducee, and by and large, the Hasmoneans sided with the Sadducees, and they were instrumental in bringing in a number of innovations that offended the law of Moses and offended the people. Well, it wasn't very long until they were betrayed by a man named Antipater the Idumean. Now, if you read your Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi, you won't read about any Idumeans. And then all of a sudden, you get to the New Testament and we've got these Idumean people. And who in the world are they? Well, they're the same people that we know in the Old Testament as Edomites. Edomites. Now, who are Edomites? I heard somebody say it. Yeah, they're the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. So they're really first cousins to the Israelites, right? The Israelites descended from Jacob or Israel, and the Edomites descended from Esau or Edom. And so they're first cousins, but they've been at war with one another really ever since the Exodus. Remember when Moses tried to lead the people back to the Promised Land, and they actually sent an entreaty to the Edomites and asked if they could just simply pass peacefully through their land, and the Edomites wouldn't let them do it? And so they've been at war, and they've had this rivalry ever since ancient times. And Antipater, who is an Idumean, ends up betraying the Hasmoneans and sets up his son Herod to be the king of all of Palestine. Now, this is Herod the Great that is on the throne when Jesus is born. All right? Now, Herod the Great does a lot of things, some of which were calculated to win the loyalty of the Jewish people. He proselyted and became a Jew, even though he was ethnically an Edomite. He also began a number of important building projects, not the least of which was the temple that was in Jerusalem at the time when Jesus was preaching and performing his ministry. As a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 24, for example, when Jesus' disciples point out the buildings of the temple complex to Jesus and talk about the magnificence of it, they're looking at Herod's temple. And the Jews were very proud of it because he had taken what had been a fairly humble little temple that had been built by Nehemiah back in the days of the return from the Persian Empire, and he had built this magnificent complex over it. And it was much, much grander than what the Jews had had for centuries. So they're very proud of it, and they tolerate a lot of Herod's madness. And I use the word advisedly because he was quite mad in various ways. One of the things he was incredibly paranoid. And he had good reason to be. I mean, he came from a long line of traitors, and right there in his own house there were a number of traitors. Two of his sons were caught conspiring to assassinate him. One of them actually attempted it and got caught in the act. They were put to death. But by his last will and testament before he died, Herod the Great divided his kingdom among three of his sons. Archelaus he set up over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, and he gave him the title of king. Archelaus' younger brother, Antipas, he named a tetrarch. Tetrarch means ruler over a fourth. And he gave him the lands of Galilee and Perea. I don't know how well you can see the map, but the lighter shaded areas are Galilee and Perea on the map, and that's the area that Antipas was allowed to rule over. Antipas's half-brother Philip was given most of the land to the east of Antipas's land, that is, over on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And he was also called a tetrarch. And so you have Archelaus, who rules essentially half of the kingdom, and then Philip and Antipas, who divide the remaining half between them. All right, now, Antipas is in a position of being over Galilee, which is where Jesus and his family returned to after fleeing to Egypt to escape Herod the Great when Herod the Great was trying to kill the infant Jesus. They returned back to Nazareth, and Jesus grows up in the area of Nazareth in Galilee, and he begins his ministry and does a lot of work in Nazareth in Galilee. So here we are now in the time of Jesus. Now, the next time that we read about Antipas in the New Testament is the account of the murder of John the Baptist. 3 of our 4 gospel accounts retell this story for us. Matthew in chapter 14, Mark in chapter 6, and then Luke alludes to it twice, both in chapter 3 and in chapter 9 of his account of the gospel. But you remember the story. Herod Antipas had married his half-brother Philip's wife. And John called him out on it. John said to him, "It's unlawful for you to have your brother Philip's wife." In other words, you're committing adultery. As a consequence, Herod had John put in prison. However, and this is interesting, the gospel accounts tell us that Herod would listen to John, and he would let him preach to him, although for whatever reason, Herod never changed his activities. So I suppose we could draw a couple of conclusions from that. Either number one, Herod was hard-hearted, and although he listened to John, he wouldn't let it change his behavior. Or number two, and I tend to think this is maybe the more likely of the two, Herod was just toying with him. He viewed it as entertainment. Now, I say that based on something we're going to see in a little while, but I tend to think that Herod was a man whose heart was not at all sensitive to spiritual things. and a man who sneered and scoffed at the truth of God. At any rate, you know the story of the murder of John the Baptist, and you can't describe this birthday party of Herod's in any way other than to say it was a party that was filled with debauchery, and as a consequence, a drunken Herod sees his, I guess, stepdaughter dancing, and he is pleased by that and offers to give her anything up to half his kingdom. She consults with her mother. Her mother says, have him deliver the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod sends and has it done, and John is murdered. Now, remember who John is to Jesus. In the flesh, they're cousins. And they can't be too terribly separated in age, because if you remember in Luke's account, Mary and Elizabeth's pregnancies overlap. There's a time when the two of them meet when they're both pregnant with John and Jesus, and they spend some time together. And so at the most, John can only be a few months older than Jesus, and they're cousins. But there's something much more important about John than just the fact that he has a familial connection with Jesus, and that is the fact that John is commissioned by God to be the forerunner for the ministry of Jesus. And John evidently willingly accepts that role, including a number of sacrifices. Now think about what it would be like to be John the Baptist, to spend your career in the wilderness, separated from the main part of Jewish life. And you live out in the wilderness and you survive on locusts and wild honey. Now, the honey part doesn't sound so bad, but I don't know about you, but eating bugs doesn't sound especially appetizing to me. But I think the point, of course, is that John lived a separated life, and he preached. And if you read the preaching of John, it's very forthright. John's a bit of a firebrand at times. Remember, he calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers. He really doesn't pull any punches with his preaching, but the people go out and they hear him and they listen to him, and a great many, especially the common folks, go out and are baptized by John. And John, of course, is laying the groundwork for and ultimately pointing toward Jesus. And so John's work is very, very important for the work of Jesus. Now, Jesus recognizes the worth of John, so much so that on one occasion he says, among those born of a woman, there has none arisen who is greater than John. Now he goes on to point out that the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John, in the sense that those who are the least in the kingdom of heaven get to enjoy the realization of the prophecies that John worked to help bring about. But John himself would not live to see the church established. He would not live to see Jesus ruling and reigning in his church because he was murdered by Herod. And I think that Jesus had a very hard feeling toward Herod as a consequence of how he treated John and evidently who he was. And there's a reason I say that, because out of all of the events that are recorded for us in the Gospels about Jesus and about his life, I can only think of one person in the entire time Jesus was on earth who sought to see Jesus, and Jesus would not even make an effort at all to give him an audience. And when Jesus was finally forced to confront him, would not even speak to him. And that's Herod Antipas. And so when I say what I said a moment ago, that I think he was essentially playing with John, toying with him, using him for entertainment rather than actually listening to what he had to say with an open heart, I say that because of the reaction that Jesus has toward Herod. Jesus will not give him the time of day. And that, to me, speaks volumes about the character of this man, because look at the people who came to Jesus, and Jesus not only countenanced them, but ate with them and spoke to them. It was people who were frequently characterized as what? Publicans and sinners and people who were considered the dregs of society. And Jesus was often taken to task by the Pharisees because he would spend time with these people and he would give them audience. Now, what effect did Jesus have on those people? Did he condone their lifestyle? Did he treat them as though whatever sins characterized their lives were okay? No. You want an example? Look at the story of Zacchaeus. Here's a publican who comes out to see Jesus. Now, I've always sort of resonated with the story of Zacchaeus because I know what it is to be a wee little man. And he climbs up this sycamore tree trying to see Jesus, remember? And Jesus not only speaks to him, but actually goes into his house and teaches him. And we see Zacchaeus make a 180-degree turn in his lifestyle as a consequence of his encounter with Jesus. And that's the sort of work that Jesus is doing with these folks. But Jesus knows the hearts of everyone, and he won't even give Herod a chance. And I can't help but infer from that Jesus knew that Herod wasn't interested in making a change. Herod wasn't looking for Jesus in order to learn from him. He was looking for him, evidently, to be entertained by him. Now, let's see where I get that. Oh, I went backwards, sorry. Turn with me over to Luke chapter 9, and let's look at verse 9. This is one of Luke's accounts of the murder of John. Let's start reading in verse 6. And as they here is Jesus and the 12 apostles, as they were leaving, they began going throughout the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. Now you remember in Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus and his disciples come to Caesarea and he asks his disciples, who do men say that I am? And their reply was, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah or one of the prophets, right? This is exactly what Herod is hearing. And Herod says in verse 9, I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things? Now mark this at the end of verse 9. And he kept trying to see him. Now, we don't have any account of Jesus ever giving Herod an audience except at the very end of his ministry before his crucifixion, and that was not by choice. The only time Jesus ever mentions Herod is in two contexts. One is found in Mark chapter 8 and verse 15. The other is found in Luke chapter 13. The one in Mark chapter 8 I think is extremely interesting because in Mark chapter 8, and Mark's the only one that records this for us, Jesus lumps Herod in with the Pharisees, and he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, let's think about the teaching of Jesus for a moment. When Jesus uses leaven in that sort of a context, what is he saying? Yeah, a corrupting influence, right? Jesus is using leaven because it's something the people are familiar with. They literally every day made bread. And they made, as a general rule, leavened bread. Unleavened bread was primarily reserved for times when you needed bread really quickly or special occasions when it was specifically called for, like the days of unleavened bread, things of that nature. But the general daily bread that people made was leavened bread. And every family would have had in the courtyard of their house an outdoor oven. And it would have been a daily sight for children growing up in Jewish families to see mother go to the grain bin and take out a measure of grain and take a little hand-cranked mill and mill that grain into a flour, and then take that flour and some olive oil and make a dough and impregnate it with yeast and let that dough rise. And when that dough was proofed and had risen, then she would put it into the oven in the courtyard and bake their daily bread, and that was what they would eat. Now, in those days and times, the common people, they didn't eat meat 3 times a day the way we do. meat for the average person was reserved for special occasions or maybe one meal a day, but eating meat at every meal was pretty much unheard of. The main substance of the food they ate was their bread, and you even see it reflected in some of the words that are used to speak about eating generally. In fact, when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray in Matthew chapter 6, he says to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Now, he's not here praying exclusively for bread, to the exclusion of vegetables and meat and things of that nature. Bread stands for food in that context. But it stands for food because it was such an important part of their daily life. And so when he talks about leaven, that's because everybody that's listening to him knows very well you can take this pile of flour and oil, and unless you introduce yeast into it, it'll be flat as a flitter. When Mama bakes it, you'll have that little flat unleavened bread cake, but when she puts the yeast in it, it entirely changes the character of the bread. And so they understood the idea of an influence that permeates and changes the character of something. And so Jesus uses that figure of speech to describe the Pharisees, and he uses it quite often. But here in Mark chapter 8, he lumps Herod in with that. Now, what is the one thing that we know about that Herod had done that might be influential on the average Jewish person that would have a corrupting influence? Well, he was rather infamous for his marital intrigues, not the least of which was the matter with Philip's wife. As a matter of fact, it was his marital intrigues that ultimately led to his banishment and exile in Gaul, what we know today as France. Now, think about this just a moment. That was a place in that time that was ruled and controlled by people that were considered barbarians. If you've watched the Olympics, you know they still control that part of the world. But at any rate, he was exiled over to the barbaric country of the Gauls, and a part of that was a consequence of one of his marital intrigues. Now, the Jewish people see this man who's ruler over their territories, and what's he doing? Well, he's a celebrity, and he's marrying whomever he pleases. Do you think that might have impacted their view of marriage and the family? How much has Hollywood impacted our country's view of marriage and the family? It's all but destroyed it, hasn't it? Watching celebrities, people who are held up as important people, marry and divorce and remarry and have children out of wedlock and do all of the things that they do, it's damaged greatly our concept of marriage. Well, we know that Herod was involved in that. Jesus lumps him in here with the Pharisees and says, "Beware the leaven of Herod," perhaps warning the people, don't follow his example in matters of the family. The other time he mentions him is over in Luke chapter 13, and I find this one incredibly interesting. Turn with me over to Luke chapter 13. Now, if you look back in verse 22 of chapter 13, Jesus is passing through the cities and villages, teaching, and he's working his way toward Jerusalem for what will ultimately be the last time during his ministry. But he is confronted by some Pharisees in verse 31. And the text says, "At that very time, some Pharisees approached, saying to him, 'Go away and leave this place, because Herod wants to kill you.'" That's interesting to me. One of two things is at work here. Either the Pharisees are lying because they just want Jesus gone, which we know they did want Jesus gone. They're opposed to the work that he's doing, and getting him out of their villages and away from influencing the people that they've been influencing will, in their estimation, improve their stock with the people. And so getting rid of him might be a good idea, and they might think it's a good idea to the extent that they're willing to fabricate this story in order to try to scare him away. The other possibility, of course, is that they're telling the truth, and Herod does want to kill him. Well, why would Herod want to kill him? I don't know. If we read between the lines, it's at least a possibility that Herod's made a number of efforts to see Jesus, and Jesus won't give him an audience. We already saw that he was seeking an opportunity to see Jesus, And we don't have a single record anywhere in any of the gospel accounts of Jesus ever giving Herod an audience at any time during his ministry until the very end, right before his crucifixion. And again, as I said before, that wasn't a voluntary audience that Jesus gave. Perhaps Herod has gotten frustrated and aggravated with this idea, and he wants to kill him. Perhaps Herod heard what Jesus said in Mark 8:15, that Jesus described him to the people as a corrupting influence and wanted him dead. I don't know. But at any rate, the Pharisees say, "Go away and leave this place because Herod wants to kill you." Now listen to Jesus' response. I find this incredibly interesting. He said to them, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I am casting out demons and performing healings today and tomorrow, and on the third day I reach my goal, or I am perfected. Nevertheless, I must go on my journey today and tomorrow and the next day, for it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside Jerusalem." Do you get what Jesus is saying there? Number one, he calls Herod an old fox, which is not a compliment. And number two, he essentially says, you go tell him if he wants to see me, he knows where he can find me. And in case he doesn't, here's where I'm headed. Jesus is not expressing a kindly disposition toward Herod. Jesus doesn't have anything good to say about this man. You go tell that old fox, he can find me where I am. And I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I don't know about you, but I really want to ask Jesus some questions about that when I get to heaven. Lord, what was on your mind when you said that? I realize that if we go back and read the history of Herod Antipas, a fox is a very apt description. He was a sly, maneuvering, cunning sort of a fellow who was always working this angle or that angle to get what he wanted. He was always trying to butter up this ruler or that ruler. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it failed miserably. But he was a fox. That was a very apt description. But Jesus doesn't just call him a fox. He tells the Pharisees, you go tell him I called him a fox. No fear on Jesus' part whatsoever. That's fascinating to me. And then he says, essentially, he knows where to find me. I'm right here in the middle of his jurisdiction. I'm going about from city to city. What I'm doing is not hidden. It's not a secret. I'm right here, and I'm going to be here until I head to Jerusalem. So he tells him where he's going. If he wants to see me, he knows where he can find me. There's no fear there. But there's also no, I'd like to meet him and sit down and talk to him. Jesus doesn't seem to have any use at all for Herod. Now, let's look at, I keep doing that, I'm sorry. I messed up on this slide. Here it is, the end of July, and I've already made a mistake this year. That should say Luke 23, 7 through 12, not Luke 8. I don't know where I got Luke 8 from. But Luke chapter 23, verses 7 through 12, is the account of Jesus meeting with Herod in the context of his trials. Now, a couple of interesting things here. Luke is the only one of the gospel writers who gives us an account of Jesus before Herod. And Luke, incidentally, talks about Herod more than any of the other gospel writers. Matthew only ever mentions him in conjunction with the murder of John the Baptist. Mark only ever mentions him in conjunction with the murder of John and what Jesus said about his leaven in Mark chapter 8. Luke mentions him several times. John never does. But Luke, being the very careful historian that he was, gives us this little interlude in the trials of Jesus. And let's look at what's going on here. Now remember the order of the trials of Jesus. Number one, he's arrested at night, which under Jewish law is illegal in the first place. He's taken to the high priest's household, and a perfunctory trial starts there. That's illegal under the laws of the Jews. They find what we might say in our court system, probable cause to take him to the next level. And so they take him to the Sanhedrin, which also meets before daybreak, which is also illegal. And the Sanhedrin finds him guilty, but they want to put him to death. Now there's a slight problem here. One of the things that came about when Antipater betrayed the Hasmonean dynasty was that he invited the Romans in, and the Romans had obtained sovereignty over Judea in this time. And the Romans reserved for themselves the right to inflict capital punishment. And so the Sanhedrin knows that they can't sentence Jesus to death and carry out that sentence without the blessing of the Roman authorities. And so first thing in the morning, they take Jesus to Pilate, who is the Roman governor who's in residence in Jerusalem, and they're seeking his blessing to put Jesus to death. Pilate doesn't want to do it. Pilate's a lot of things, but Adomia is not one of them, and he perceives right away that what's going on here is some kind of a jealousy feud, that these Jewish rulers don't like what Jesus is doing, they don't like him, and they want a rival put out of their way, and they want Pilate to do it, and Pilate really doesn't want to be a party to that. Plus, he examines Jesus and doesn't find any legal reason to put him to death. And now he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, at least from his perspective. He doesn't want to upset the Jews again. Now, I say again because Pilate has very famously upset the Jews in the not-so-distant past. Before this, he had plundered the tomb of David, the king, and had taken gold out of it, and the Jews were absolutely incensed at him as a consequence of that. And he doesn't want them to rebel against himself and against Rome, because even if Rome comes in and quells the rebellion and puts down the Jews, the fact that it happened on his watch is probably going to cost him his head, and at the very least his rulership. And so he doesn't want a riot on his hands. He doesn't want to upset the Jewish leadership. However, on the other hand, he doesn't want to be their puppet either. He doesn't want them to be able to play him to get whatever they want to put their political rivals out of the game. And so he doesn't want to put Jesus to death without any good reason. And finally, in questioning Jesus, he learns that Jesus is from Galilee. And he thinks he sees a loophole. Oh, you're a Galilean. You're just down here visiting for the Passover feast. You're not under my jurisdiction. There's Herod right over there on the other side of town. He's your tetrarch. I'll just send him over to Herod. And then I don't have to worry about it. And if Herod wants to put him to death, well, then that's on Herod. And if Herod wants to let him live, well, that's on Herod. And either way, I get the Jews off my back. Well, it doesn't work out that way, but that's what he's thinking. And so he sends him over to Herod. Now, let's begin reading in verse 7, Luke chapter 23. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, since he also was in Jerusalem at this time. Now, Herod was overjoyed when he saw Jesus. Now, stop there just a moment. Remember, the Pharisees said, Herod wants to kill you. We've not heard that from Herod's mouth. And by the way, what's going on when Herod sees Jesus here? The Jews are literally asking him to kill Jesus. And Pilate has essentially served him up on a silver platter and said, here, if you want to kill him, kill him. It's all yours. I don't think the Pharisees were telling the truth back in chapter 13. Because if Herod wanted to kill Jesus, he's got a golden opportunity here. He doesn't do it. He's overjoyed to see Jesus. Why is he overjoyed to see Jesus? Well, at first blush, you would think, well, perhaps he wants to listen to his teachings. Perhaps he wants to learn from him. But against that idea is the way Jesus has talked about him, and the fact that Jesus will never give him an opportunity to see him during his ministry, and the way Jesus behaves during this encounter. Watch what happens. Herod is overjoyed when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Now we get a little bit of insight. He wants to see a sign. Now, stop and analyze that for just a moment, because in and of itself, is the desire to see a sign a bad thing necessarily? No. Remember at the end of Mark chapter 16, Mark records for us that the disciples were everywhere preaching the word, the Lord confirming the word with the signs that followed. In a period of time when the New Testament had not yet been written, the only way to show that the gospel that they were preaching was genuinely from God was to corroborate it with a miraculous sign that only God could do. And people who saw those signs could say, hey, this is the truth. If I obey what these people are saying, I can be confident that this is what God wants me to do, because I've seen something that the laws of nature won't allow. So the mere idea of wanting to see a sign might be the quest of an honest mind wanting to see if what's being taught by this man is genuinely from God or not. After all, he claimed to be from God, didn't he? But again, against that idea is the way Jesus reacts. He wants to see a sign. What's another possibility from someone wanting to see a sign? Entertainment. Who doesn't enjoy a good magic show? I can remember as a child David Copperfield's specials coming on TV and watching him apparently walk through the Great Wall of China. Do y'all remember that? And making, was it the Statue of Liberty disappear? And all of these amazing feats that you thought, how in the world can he do this? And of course, we knew at the time that it was merely an illusion. He had somehow concocted this thing to look like something was happening that wasn't actually happening. But when Jesus was doing his signs, they were amazing feats, but they were actually happening. It wasn't merely an illusion. And the proof was right there in front of people. I mean, you could look and see this man who had been deaf all of his life suddenly could hear you and converse with you. This man who had been lame from birth is now up walking around. This person who had had leprosy and essentially had a death sentence is now clean and whole, and their skin is as fresh as a baby's. But there are some people who just wanted to see something exciting, something new, something different. It's kind of like going to the circus. And I have to conclude from all the evidence that that's all that Herod's up to here. He wants to be entertained by Jesus. So, he questioned him, verse 9, at some length, but he offered him no answer at all. Jesus just flat won't speak to him. Now, Jesus spoke to Pilate. Remember that Jesus knew everything that was happening there, and Jesus knew full well that Pilate was going to sentence him to death. But he converses with Pilate, discusses a number of things with him. He won't even say boo to Herod. And he answers him not at all. Now the chief priests and the scribes stood there, vehemently charging him, and Herod, together with his soldiers, watch this, treated him with contempt. That tells you everything you need to know about Herod's character. Treated him with contempt and mocked him, dressing him in a brightly shining robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Now, Herod couldn't get a show out of Jesus, so he made his own show. This time it was a comedy show, a mockery. And after he mocks him and Jesus won't countenance him, he sends him back to Pilate. Look at verse 12. And so Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for previously they had been enemies toward each other. Tells me a little something about Pilate's character too, doesn't it? We initially see Pilate as a man who's conflicted, caught between doing what he knows is right and what's expedient. But the fact that he befriends a man like this tells us something about his heart as well. Well, what do we learn from the life of Herod Antipas? Number one, crossing God is a serious matter. Many of the prophets were killed as a consequence of their work on behalf of God. But Jesus makes it clear, and so do many others, woe to the man by whom they are killed. Herod was one such man. Mocking God himself is a serious matter. And being one who has a character like that, who will murder God's messengers and mock God himself will cause Jesus to turn a cold shoulder toward that person. Sometimes I struggle with the idea of Jesus turning a cold shoulder toward anyone, but then I think about his interactions with Herod, and I say to myself, of all the things that I might fall into, Lord, please never let me fall into that kind of hardness of heart, that I may never be like Herod, so that you won't even give me the time of day. Thank you so much for your attention.